So what are the bourbon rules? If this is the global whiskey rule, how do the bourbon rules line up against this? What do we know about bourbon's grain recipe? Does it specify a particular grain? At least 51% corn. Global, use grain. Bourbon, you have to use corn. Does it have a maximum number? Can you make a bourbon from 100% corn? You sure can. This is a minimum requirement, 51%. So we have our grain recipe of whatever definition it is. We are going to mash it. We're here in Kentucky. We're going to mash it with our water. We are going to add yeast and ferment. Spirit is produced. And just like on the global level, we're going to have to distill. Now, bourbon says, wait a minute. 190 proof is pretty darn high, because if one tick over makes you a vodka, what does that tell you about high proof distillation? It is going towards neutrality. And neutrality is defined as ethanol, ethyl alcohol. In other words, the higher the proof of distillation, the less flavor and character the spirit has. So it stands to reason, if we're going to have a really neat grain recipe with, say, corn, rye, and malted barley here at Woodford Reserve, why do we want to distill to a point where you can't taste the effects of the grain? So bourbon distills below 160 proof. That's pretty darn low. So you can taste the organoleptic characteristics of the corn and your other grains. That's very important. Now, our spirit has been produced, and it's time to move into that oak container. Bourbon has a little rule we're going to slide in there, and it's called the barrel entry requirement. You can't just distill at, say, 140 proof or 150 proof and go right into a barrel. No bourbon is allowed to be entered into a barrel at more than 125 proof. Every bourbon distillery in Kentucky distills its final spirit at over 125 proof. Every bourbon distillery in Kentucky adds what to reduce to no more than 125 proof? Water. That's all we can do is add water. What do we know about the bourbon barrel? It must be new, can never have been used before. It must be charred on the inside, and nowhere in the rules does it say you have to use a white oak barrel. We do use white oak, but we don't have to by law. We'd be dumb not to use it, because the only other type of oak is red oak, and it has a flaw in this whole scheme of things. It doesn't hold liquid. So you're going to use white oak because that's all you can use. So a new charred barrel, just like the global rule, no age requirement for bourbon. The minute that new spirit goes into a new charred oak barrel, it can be called bourbon whiskey. And we could immediately empty that new charred barrel and have still a clear spirit that does not resemble bourbon as we know it, because it hasn't spent any time in that wood, and we could bottle it as bourbon whiskey. And we would have to state, this bourbon whiskey has been aged less than 1 day on the label. When we leave the barrel many years later to be bottled at no less than 80 proof, like the global rule states, all bourbon can have added to it is pure water. We cannot add anything but water to reduce to our bottling proof. And that's significant because most of the other major whiskey families in the world, Scotch, Irish, English, Japanese whiskeys, can add caramel for coloring. We add water 2 places, before barreling and as part of the bottling process. There's one last rule that governs the production of bourbon. It's place of origin. Where does bourbon come from?
United States.
United States. We wish it all came from Kentucky. I wish that was a rule, but it's not. It is America's spirit. It's hard to make a bourbon taste like it's from Kentucky because these other distilleries don't have the climate, don't have the water, different grain sources, but they can still make bourbon.